I work with a bunch of data scientists, and my job, by and large, is to take what those data scientists do and say and to translate it into something that everybody can understand and appreciate. So I sort of think of myself more as like a data science interpreter or a data science translator. And that's kind of how I fit nicely into the state of Canada's birds, because the state of Canada's birds really is a big exercise in data interpretation, in taking data and making something that is meaningful to people of all different backgrounds and knowledge levels. So that's kind of, I guess, the theme of what we'll deal with tonight. So I'm gonna chat a little bit about the state of Canada's birds. I recognize that there are probably people here who have done some reading about it already. Maybe you've checked out the report. Maybe you've taken a deep dive into it, so you know a few things about it. But equally likely, there are some folks here who maybe haven't explored it, or maybe this is the very first you're hearing about it. So we'll try to hit all the levels tonight. I'll give you a broad introduction. We'll cover some of the big talking points. We'll do some more detailed insights, and then we'll have lots of time for questions as well. So if you already have done the run through State of Canada's birds and you have some burning questions, that's great because we'll have time for that too. And I'm always happy to answer those. So that's kind of what we'll do tonight. So to give you the very backgroundy background, if I can get my slideshow moving here, come along, slideshow. They never do what you want. There we go. You should know that the State of Canada's Birds is a partnership between Birds Canada, which is a charitable, non-governmental organization, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, which is the government, the federal government. This is a partnership between both, hopefully capitalizing on the strengths of both. It is an online resource, so it's something that you access on the internet. And basically, the point of it is to answer the question, how are birds in Canada doing? Which is a simple question, but as I'm sure you can imagine, doesn't really have a simple answer. It has a kind of a complicated answer. So it's a big question and there's lots of nuance, but that is the goal, is to answer that question. And State of Canada's Birds as well is meant to be a tool for everyone. So I believe, and it was our intention, that there is something in the State of Canada's Birds for you if you are a bird researcher, if you are an academic ornithologist, if you're a citizen science participant, or if you're a person who doesn't really know anything or care that much about birds, and everybody in between. So it sort of hits on all levels, and hopefully there's something for everybody, even your neighbor who doesn't think about birds. They could read State of Canada's Birds and take something from it, I hope, anyways. Now, before we get too deeply into what it is, I think it's slightly useful, maybe only for me, but it's slightly useful to consider where it comes from, because the State of Canada's Birds has its sort of origin, its foothold in three things, three products that already existed, and one or more of them may be familiar to you. The first, and maybe the least likely to be familiar, is something called the Status of Birds in Canada website. This is a website produced by the Government of Canada. It has individual species accounts for most of the bird species that you would regularly find in Canada. And in those species accounts, you find an in-depth analysis of what's going on with that bird in Canada up until now. So there's lots of information in this. It's very information dense. It's not super approachable or user-friendly, if we're totally honest. It really is a technical resource. So it's not something that your neighbor who doesn't think much about birds is going to be able to really engage with or get anything out of, but it is a rich source of information for researchers. On the flip side, we have something called the State of Canada's Birds reports. And these are two standalone reports. They came out in 2012 and 2019. They are produced by a thing called NABC Canada, which is the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, with a bunch of partners, including Birds Canada. And these are kind of the opposite of the complicated website. These are kind of user-friendly print or PDF reports which give you a big broad picture of what's going on with birds in Canada. They divide the birds in Canada up into some big groups, and they give you an idea of what's happening with each group. And then they also try to motivate conservation action among people in Canada as well. So these are big, broad picture, water cooler talking points. They don't dive really deep into each species, into heavy detail or anything like that. They're meant to be approachable for folks who don't really have a background in birds. And then the third thing that kind of underpins the state of Canada's birds is Nature Counts, which is that data platform that I was talking about at the beginning. Nature Counts is the biggest, by a long shot, source of data on birds in Canada, but it is raw data. It's not interpreted information. It's not lovely stories. It's literally data, which is great if you're a researcher or a conservation actor who needs those raw data. Not so useful if you're just a person who's kind of curious what's going on with birds, who's maybe not going to do a great big data analysis on their own, which includes most of us. So these three things are all great. They all have strengths and they all have drawbacks. And so the idea of the state of Canada's birds is to take the strengths of these three things and to mash them together into one cohesive resource. So that's where it comes from. That's a long way of explaining where State of Canada's birds comes from. And now, how does State of Canada's birds combine these strengths? Well, it does it in two related but slightly different pieces. The first is a report. So very much like those reports from 2019 and 2012, the State of Canada's Birds features a summary report. It's very user-friendly. It's very pretty to look at, I think. It's got big, broad stories about what's going on with birds in Canada as a whole. It looks at some big groups of birds that have interesting stories to tell, and it provides action that people in Canada can take to help birds and to make Canada a better place for birds. And so this is super friendly to people who don't really think about birds, who don't have a background in birds, and who are looking for those big, broad stories. And then on the flip side, we have species accounts. So there are 463 species accounts. That's one for every species of bird that regularly occurs in Canada. And those accounts are where you're going to get your details. So if you're a detail person, if you want to take the deep dive, if you want to learn everything you can about what's going on with your favorite species, if you're doing research, this is going to be the part of the resource that's really useful to you. It's got ways that you can interact with the actual data. So you can produce different graphs, you can download data, you can produce maps. It's got lots of expert analysis as well, from experts at Birds Canada and Environment and Climate Change, and even a few external groups as well for certain species. So this is where you can really get lots of great detailed information. I think of these two parts kind of like siblings, like they're really closely related. They were raised by the same people, but they look a bit different when you interact with them, and they'll give you different stories. And so the summary report is like the sibling that went to art school, and the species accounts is like the sibling that did a PhD in math. And they're both lovely people, but they're very different from each other in a way. So we'll kind of look at both tonight. We'll look at the big stories from the summary report and some insights from the accounts as well. So we'll start with where the summary report starts, and that is with this graph. I should mention that we're going to look at some graphs tonight. I should lead with that up front. I'll make it as painless as possible, but this is a data product, so you got to figure there's going to be a few graphs, but that's okay. Don't stress about them. Bear with me and we'll work our way through them. But this is the one that starts off the summary report. We affectionately refer to this as the spaghetti graph, for hopefully obvious reasons. And what this does is it takes 10 groups of birds in Canada that have interesting stories to tell, and it plots the average change in the populations of those groups over time. And that time begins at 1970. Why 1970? Well, it turns out that's pretty much where our reliable, consistent bird data begins. We do have bird data that goes back past that, but the sort of comprehensive, reliable data that we need to do this kind of analysis begins for most groups around 1970. And that's kind of nice. It gives us a 50+ year period to look at, which is a nice long time, and we can really see some trends in these different groups of birds. Now, I won't go into each one individually right now. The report gives each of these groups of birds a full treatment. We don't quite have time for that tonight, but we will look at some of the, what I think are maybe the most notable stories from this. And then, of course, you can always check out the report on your own as well to fill in the gaps. The other figure that starts off the report is this one. This shows us all of the species, the regularly occurring species of birds in Canada, and it breaks them up by what their population has done over the last 50 years. Has it increased? Has it stayed the same? Or has it decreased? And we can see here, somewhat surprisingly, to me at least, about a third of our species in Canada, their populations have increased over the last 50 years. And that was not something maybe I would have expected, although if you think about it, it actually does make a bit of sense because a lot of these species had populations which had declined by the middle of last century. So the early to mid 1900s was not a time where people were thinking a lot about bird conservation. And so by the mid 1900s, a number of species had declined. And these increasing populations for a lot of species represent a recovery. And that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit as well. Maybe less surprisingly, more than a third of our species have declined since 1970. And that's something I think, as people who are interested in birds, we probably all could have guessed to some degree. We know that we are making life pretty difficult for a lot of birds these days, and some populations are declining. And we'll certainly cover some of those. Uh, the one other thing that's a little bit notable down at the bottom there is that 12% of species, 54 individual species, are what we call data deficient, which means we just don't have enough information on these species to know whether they've increased, decreased, stayed the same. We have no idea. And I think that's kind of notable because we think of birds as being a very well-studied group of organisms, and they are probably the best studied group, I should say, of organisms in the world. And yet, even here in Canada, where we've got lots of citizen science and lots of bird research happening, there's still 54 species that we just don't know enough about. And so the need for more information is sort of a trend through State of Canada's birds as well. So what we'll do now is we'll look at what I think are the 5 big stories that come out of the State of Canada's birds report. The 5 water cooler talking points. Like if you're only going to know 5 things out of this report, these are the ones that I think are most important. And if you held my feet to the fire and you made me pick one most important story out of State of Canada's birds, it's this one. And that is grassland birds. Grassland birds in Canada are absolutely in crisis. Now, the way that these graphs work, this is the graph out of the grassland birds section of the report. It shows one line for grassland birds as a whole. And then some of these groups, they break out some subgroups, some smaller groups as well. So our line for grassland birds as a whole is in the middle here. And it shows that grassland birds have declined since 1970 by 67% on average. Now, that's very neatly 2/3. That's a lot. That's very concerning. I don't think I need to emphasize that. But even more concerning is that line on the bottom. That line on the bottom refers to grassland birds who are specialists of native prairie grasslands. They need native prairie grasslands to survive, and those birds have declined on average by 90%. In the case of some of those birds, it's even more severe than that. And no birds tell that story better than the longspurs. This is chestnut-collared longspur on the top and thick-billed longspur on the bottom, and they've declined by 95 and 98% respectively. So that's a bird that's just disappearing. These are the graphs that come from the species accounts. They look a little more daunting to look at if you're not used to looking at graphs. Don't stress about them. I put them there just for interest's sake. If we have interesting things on those graphs, I'll point them out and make sure everybody knows. So don't worry about it if those look a little bit alien to you. That's not a problem at all. Those big numbers are really what we're concerned about. So we know that these longspurs have declined by well over 90%. Now, the threat for grassland birds is actually not complicated. It's very easy to identify. The number one threat for these birds is habitat. It is grasslands. We think often of the prairies, especially, as a big grassland. And traditionally, historically, a lot of it is. But today, the prairie grasslands have largely been converted for agriculture. Especially problematic is agricultural monocropping, so where you get fields of just a single crop. They've been converted for development and for resource extraction in some cases as well. And so those native prairie grasslands have been destroyed or fragmented, broken up. A lot of these birds are not tolerant to any sort of disturbance like roads and things like that. So that is the number one problem for these birds. To save our prairie birds, we need to save prairie grasslands. And that's really as simple as it gets. Not easy to do, but a simple problem to understand. Now, in case you're thinking that grassland birds are just a prairie problem, they're actually not. The prairies certainly are Canada's greatest expanse of grasslands and contain a lot of our grassland birds, but there are grassland birds all across the country. One that's much more ubiquitous in the West, in British Columbia, would be something like Western meadowlark. And even Western meadowlark has declined pretty substantially. Not quite long spur levels of decline, but 54% is a lot. And actually, one of the areas where this bird is declining most strikingly is on the Pacific coast, the southwestern British Columbia. And so there, wherever you live in Canada, there is a grassland bird, at least near you, that is declining as well. So grasslands are important even where they make up a smaller percentage of the total habitat as well. And the birds that live in them are in trouble everywhere. So not just a prairie problem. Okay, our second big story out of the state of Canada's birds, also not a particularly good news story. We'll try to build towards good news stories, but this one is not too positive either, and that has to do with shorebirds. Shorebirds, their declines have been documented for a while, and this report confirms what we already basically knew, which is that they are declining. Notably, our shorebird data begins a bit later than a lot of those other birds. So this graph begins not at 1970, but at 1980. And even in that shorter time frame, shorebirds have declined by an average of 42%. So that's pretty significant as well. Now, unlike the grassland birds, the problems for shorebirds are complex. These birds are tricky. They live in different habitats. They travel, so they migrate often great distances in the non-breeding season, and they're quite varied in their behaviors and things as well. So it's not a single easy picture with shorebirds. But one thing that we do know is that this is a group of birds that is already feeling the effects, I shouldn't say already at this point, but is feeling the effects of climate change. When we think about shorebirds, whether you're in BC as you are or in Ontario as I am in the south, we see many of our shorebirds on migration. And they're migrating, a lot of them, from either the Arctic tundra or from wetlands in the prairie provinces. And both of those habitats are suffering the impact of climate change. In the Arctic, the big problem is what we would call asynchrony, which just means the timing is out of whack. The reason that these birds fly all the way north to the Arctic tundra, they make this huge journey to the tundra, is to take advantage in the breeding season of the emergence of things like insects, and in some cases, fruit like berries as well. But climate change is changing the timing of those events. And so in some cases, you've got birds returning to the Arctic to take advantage of this food resource, and it's not there when they need it to be there. And so that is one way that climate change is affecting these Arctic birds. In the prairie wetlands, climate change is having a different effect. Prairie wetlands have a drought cycle, and there's a natural cycle where some seasons are drier and some seasons are wetter. But climate change is accelerating that cycle, so the droughts are happening more frequently, and they're exacerbating the droughts. They're making them worse. And so you have worse, more frequent droughts, and that's causing problems for the birds that breed there. So shorebirds suffering from a few different things, but one of them being climate change. That Arctic problem easily illustrated by a couple of our lovely Arctic shorebirds. We have Whimbrel on top and Hudsonian godwit on the bottom, both of which showing really significant declines. The long migrations of these birds are likely a factor as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about long distance migrants shortly. But again, in case you think this is just a problem for far away, this is just a problem for Arctic birds or prairie birds. There are more familiar, closer to home shorebirds that are exhibiting a similar issue. And killdeer is probably our most ubiquitous shorebird across the country. For many people in Canada, this is a bird they can see close to home, even if they live in a big city. And it is declining as well by 75% since 1970. Actually, the data goes back further for killdeer, so we can go to 1970. So that is an alarming decline in a bird that we think of as being very, very common. So shorebirds are something that we need to pay a lot of attention to, and it's going to take some concerted work to address the many issues that they're facing. Okay, story number 3 from the state of Canada's birds, and a little bit of a different one, and that has to do with the group of birds that we call aerial insectivores. And you may likely have heard the term aerial insectivores in recent years because the alarm bells about their decline have been ringing now for a couple of decades. So these are birds which catch insects in flight. So things like swifts and swallows, nightjars, and flycatchers as well are included in this group. We've known for a while that they are declining, and we have not really known why. There are lots of theories, lots of people are working on aerial insectivores. Folks think it might have something to do with overall insect decline, which is quite possible. There's likely habitat effects because some of these birds live in habitats that are not doing so well. But it's always been a little bit of a mystery. And the mystery deepens with this report because, to the surprise of everybody working on the report, it does show the decline, but it also shows that those declines seem to be leveling off, or in some cases, for some species, even turning slightly upwards. And that is even more mysterious than the declines in the first place. Nobody knows why they're doing that. We don't know if that's going to sustain itself into the future, but it is absolutely what the data show, and that's really, really interesting. And hopefully, it's optimistic as well. A couple of birds illustrate this. We've got something like bank swallow on top or chimney swift on the bottom, both showing very significant declines. We can see 95% in bank swallow, 88% in chimney swift, but definitely leveling off on the bottom. And actually, both of these birds, you can't really see it because of the proportions of the graph, but they are both starting to trend a little bit upwards as well. So that's really fascinating. It doesn't mean we're out of the woods with these birds. It certainly doesn't mean they're recovering because you can see they're still 95 and 88% below where their populations were 50 years ago. But it might mean that it's not too late for these birds. We have a chance still to take action for these guys to begin to recover those populations. Maybe all is not lost when it comes to aerial insectivores, and that would be a very encouraging piece of news indeed. A bird that's showing that sort of upward trend, which is interesting, is eastern whippoorwill. Certainly a bird that is a little more familiar here in Ontario, but whippoorwill showing that jump back upwards in the last decade and a half. It's a bird that we think of as being pretty imperiled here, but all of a sudden it seems to be doing a little bit better. Do we know it's going to continue to do better? We don't. But hopefully, if we put the work in, there's every chance that it will. A bird that might be a little bit more familiar out there, which is kind of a complicated story, is the purple martin. So purple martin shows an increase since 1970 in Canada of 66%, and that increase is disproportionately in the West. Purple martin has almost disappeared from here in Ontario, from the Atlantic provinces. It's almost gone, but in the West, its population is increasing significantly. And that's a tricky thing to explain. This is a bird that's reliant on human assistance now for nesting. It almost exclusively nests in human-made boxes. So maybe there's an effect being had there. And it's also a bird that's very susceptible to cold snaps when it returns to its breeding grounds in the spring. And maybe climate change is causing these more violent temperature swings in the early season. And that's causing an issue here in the east where we get more extreme weather. It's hard to say, but this is definitely a bird that's bringing up the average for the aerial insectivores in recent years. Okay, our fourth story is that there are two groups of birds included in the State of Canada's Birds Report this time that were not included in the 2012 or 2019 reports. The beauty of this report, the beauty of doing these reports periodically, is that we're getting new data all the time. The amount of bird data that we have is constantly growing at a considerable rate. And so we're able to do better analyses, to do more analyses than we were in previous versions. And so there are two groups of birds that join the report for the first time. Those are long distance migrants and Arctic birds. And we'll look at long distance migrants first. So here is the graph for long distance migrants, which doesn't have subgroups, but instead shows some groups for comparison. So we can see long distance migrants as a group on the bottom have declined on average by 29% since 1970. Those are birds which migrate to tropical regions in the non-breeding season. So that would be places like Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. And in a couple of instances, birds which migrate across the oceans, so something like northern wheatear, which goes to Africa and Asia in the winter. Short distance migrants, which migrate to temperate places like the southern United States and northern Mexico, have only declined by 12% on average. And resident birds, which stay here in Canada in the winter, have actually increased, a small increase on average of 9%. So this really suggests that there's something going on with those birds that are taking these long journeys that's putting them more at risk than birds that are not doing that. And there's lots of possible explanations for that. It may be that the journeys themselves are quite perilous and they're more likely to not make the journey, especially now as climate change brings more extreme weather events, which could be something that these birds are contending with as they fly. Um, but likely a bigger issue is that the conservation of these birds relies on things that they use in several different locations. A good example of that might be the black swift. So this is a imperiled bird for sure. This is a bird that's declined by almost 90% since 1970. This is a bird that spends its breeding season in places like British Columbia and flies south to South America in the winter, or in our winter, not winter in South America, of course, in its non-breeding season. Um, the migration of black swift actually is still a little bit mysterious. We don't entirely know where they go or how they get there, which is one problem that we have with conserving migratory species, is just understanding their migratory journeys, where they spend their non-breeding season, and what habitats they're using. And the thing that places a bird like this at risk is it's vulnerable to threats here in Canada, where it spends its breeding season. It's vulnerable to threats at stopover sites on its migration. So anywhere in between where it might stop and feed or take refuge. And it's vulnerable to threats wherever it spends its non-breeding season. So whatever countries it's in South America, if there's forest loss there or some other threats, it's vulnerable there as well. And it only takes the weakest link in the chain. So these birds can be in trouble if there is a threat in any of those places. That can be enough to put them at risk on their entire sort of year. So that's really probably the biggest issue with migratory birds. And that's why international cooperation is really, really key to conserving these species and understanding their journeys as well and what they need and where they're spending their time. Arctic birds, also new to the report this time around. Arctic birds are a bit of a mess, if we're kind of honest. If you look at this graph, it's a little all over the place. The main line for Arctic birds as a whole is second from the bottom. So Arctic birds as a group have declined by 28% on average. But when we break them apart, it makes a mess. It kind of goes all over the place. So that line on the top, that's Arctic geese and swans. They have kind of exploded. This is a group of birds that may be benefiting from warming conditions in the Arctic. They're certainly benefiting from some things on their migratory journeys, things and where they spend their winter. Things like waste grain that's available in agricultural areas has really boosted populations of these birds. So Arctic geese and swans seem to be doing just fine. They're off to the races. On the flip side, we have Arctic shorebirds who have declined on average by 54%. And that certainly tracks with what we already know about shorebirds. So shorebirds are in trouble, and Arctic shorebirds in particular are having a hard time, likely in part because of the impact of climate change, and likely in part because of the impact of their long migration distances. And then all the other Arctic birds, which includes things like Arctic songbirds, it includes things like ptarmigan, it includes things like gulls and some ducks that nest in the Arctic. On average, they've declined by 13%. So that's a small decline, maybe not too worrying, but maybe a reason to pay attention. And paying attention is sort of the most important thing, because the biggest issue with Arctic birds is something that we can easily learn by looking at the graph for willow ptarmigan. Now, I wasn't going to focus too much on these funky looking graphs, but we're going to look at this one because it tells us something important. So this is the graph from the species account for willow ptarmigan, and it has, as all of these graphs have had, something called error bars. So if you look at the point for each year, the dot for each year, there is a bar that comes out of the top and a bar that comes out of the bottom. And those are called error bars. And those error bars, they show us how confident we are in the location of that dot. So if those error bars are really short, that says we're very confident that that dot is in the right place. And if those error bars are longer, it says we're not that confident, and there's a reasonable chance that that dot could actually belong anywhere along this line. And here for willow ptarmigan, those error bars are off the charts. They're absolutely huge. And the reason for that is very simply that birds like the willow ptarmigan, Arctic birds, are very difficult to study. They live in a remote place where there aren't a lot of people. They're out of reach of a lot of our traditional monitoring programs like Christmas bird counts and breeding bird surveys. And so we just don't have a lot of information on them. And there's a lot that we don't know about Arctic birds. So we think willow ptarmigan has increased by about 29%. That's our best calculation based on the data we have. But we also recognize that we don't have a lot of data, and that could very well be off. And so that's an important thing to recognize when it's the case. And it's an important thing to know about Arctic birds, that we need to invest more in learning more about these very difficult to study birds. And that's going to include some concerted efforts to get up there and survey them. It's likely going to include some collaboration with Northern Indigenous groups as well, because there's likely a lot of good knowledge to be had there that's not currently being tapped into. So this is a group of birds we definitely need to know more about. Okay, our last big story from the state of Canada's birds. I said I would save the good news story till the end, and I am going to do that. There are three groups of birds which have increased in population on average since 1970. Those are the waterfowl, the birds of prey, and the wetland birds. And all three of these birds are making a recovery. So waterfowl, by the middle of last century, their populations had fallen significantly, mostly due to overhunting. Birds of prey had fallen significantly, mostly due to agricultural pesticides. And wetland birds, their populations had fallen largely because wetlands were simply being destroyed. So the recovery of all these groups is the result of direct conservation action. And what that tells us is that if we understand a problem that birds are facing and we take appropriate action to address that problem, we can affect change in bird populations. We can take a group which has declined severely and we can turn that decline around and we can have that line trending upwards. We can bring those populations back. And that means when we look at all those other sort of scary news stories, we should find them scary and we should find them sad, but we should also have hope because we know that there is hope and that we can make a difference for these birds. A classic example of that, the like poster child for conservation success in North America, is the peregrine falcon. So peregrine falcon by the middle of last century was just about gone from large areas of North America, had disappeared from significant parts of the continent, largely due to the agricultural pesticide known as DDT. So DDT, it worked its way up the food chain into the bodies of these birds. It actually caused them to lay soft eggs. So the eggs had a soft shell. And when the mother would sit on the eggs, she would actually crush them. And so that's a very good way to make sure you don't have any peregrine falcons born, is by making the eggs too weak to withstand the weight of the parent. And so these guys were in absolute dire straits by the middle of last century, and there was every chance that they would simply be lost from the continent on the whole. But there was a concerted effort put together to conserve peregrine falcons. There was a lot of advocacy from the general public and from the scientific community. There was action on the part of the government to ban DDTs, no longer allowed to be used in Canada or the United States. And then conservation groups undertook massive conservation efforts, including a captive breeding program to breed and release peregrine falcons back into the wild. And as a result of this, their populations have increased since 1970 by 374%, which is not a small number. And in some areas of the continent, that's the countrywide trend for them. But in some areas of the country, it's even more drastic than that. And so that's really incredible. There are places where they were just about gone, and now they're back in good numbers. They're not even listed as a species at risk anymore. And so this is the absolute poster child for conservation success in Canada and in North America. But if we want a slightly less familiar example, the wood duck is a great example. A beloved duck. Who doesn't love a wood duck? These guys were in big trouble in the middle of last century as well, largely due to unregulated market hunting, both for their meat and for the feathers, the part of the bird that we all love. Other people loved it too, and they wanted to use it in other ways. And so these guys were in big trouble by the middle of last century, but hunting regulation, so making sure that they were not overhunted, and the restoration of the wetlands they need has brought their populations back up as well. And they've increased also by over 300% since 1970. So great news that if we take action for birds, we can have a positive impact. It's not hopeless. There's absolutely reason for optimism, and that's a really important thing to take away from the State of Canada's Birds Report. With that in mind, a big goal of the report is to try to motivate people across Canada to take action for birds. One way that we're doing that is that in each group of birds, we have a section detailing the threats that those birds are facing and what kinds of conservation efforts are needed to bring those birds back to help them out. You don't have to read this in its entirety, of course. I put it there so you know what it looks like, but you can certainly read it on the report as well, so no stress. Um, we are focusing on actions that individuals can take because it's individuals reading the report. We certainly recognize as well that large scale action from government's industry will be required. And we talk about that a bit in the report too. And then when the report finishes, the last section of the report is all about taking action for birds. And there's a bit more detail than this in the report, but these are kind of the basic concepts that it covers. So creating and protecting habitat. So habitat's like a huge problem for birds all across Canada, and everybody can participate in creating habitat, whether that's planting some native plants in your backyard if you have one, or participating in some local project, or contributing to organizations that do habitat work. Fighting climate change, that's the big, scary, nebulous one, of course, but anything that we can do to reduce our impact and fight climate change from the individual level to the corporate and governmental level is very important for birds and for all wildlife. Keeping cats indoors, maybe the number one most impactful single action a person can take if you have an outdoor cat. Keep your cat indoors. That saves birds in a very concrete and obvious way. And similarly, preventing window collisions. So window collisions we used to think of as a slightly smaller threat. There's new research which puts it on par with cat-caused bird mortality. So in terms of things you can do in and around your home, indoor cats and preventing window collisions by using window treatments are very high on the list. Choosing bird-friendly products if you're able, things like bird-friendly coffee or FSC certified forest products, very, very good. Buying less and producing less waste, good for nature in general and good for birds. Advocating for birds, whether that's voting for candidates in elections who are going to do good things for nature and birds, whether that's speaking to your MPs, whether that's supporting organizations that do advocacy work, or even just talking to your friends about how important birds are and what you can do to help them. We need people to be a voice for birds. That's very important. And lastly, volunteering for conservation. There's lots of ways that you can do that. We try to provide some avenues in the report. I imagine there are folks here who volunteer for conservation, and one of the big ways that a lot of people do it is through citizen science. And citizen science, something that Birds Canada is very active in, and I'm sure some of you here as well. I think it's important to know when you look at this report, if you're perusing the report or you're checking out the species accounts, that the vast majority of the data that are used in State of Canada's birds actually come from citizen science. This whole resource just very simply would not be possible without citizen science data. I think that's really important because I think when we do citizen science, a lot of us, we do it because it's fun, because we like it, because we have some sense that it is important. But often we don't actually get to see exactly how it's used or exactly what the results of our work are. And I think this is one way that you really can see that citizen science is doing something very concrete and very important. I can tell you it's important in a million other ways too, but when you look at the State of Canada's birds, you can know that your citizen science work is being used there. For a lot of those long-term trends, we're using programs which have a long history, things like the Breeding Bird Survey, Christmas bird counts, actually a really good source of standardized long-term bird data, and some more specific programs as well. For example, the reason that owls are included in this report for the first time is because of the Nocturnal Owl Survey. So the data in the Nocturnal Owl Survey finally hit a threshold where it was good enough and long-term enough that we can use it to really get some great long-term insights on owls. And then those long-term programs are beautifully complemented by things like breeding bird atlases, the BC Coastal Waterbird Survey, marsh monitoring programs, even eBird. So citizen science really is what this report is built on. If you do citizen science, you can really feel good about it. And hopefully you will continue to do it because it will be the basis for future reports and future products as well. And it gets used in so many other wonderful ways. So that's my pitch for citizen science. I hope that I'm preaching to the choir on that one, but it is super, super important. And that actually brings me to the end. So I'll stop talking now. But if you haven't had a chance to explore the report yet and the species accounts, please do. You can find them at stateofcanadasbirds.org or through the Nature Counts website as well, just at naturecounts.ca. And I hope that you will do that because it's a lovely report, in my personal biased opinion. and it's definitely worth a read. And otherwise, I will turn it back over, and I'm definitely happy to field any and all questions that you might have to the best of my ability.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation, Kyle. And you are in the center of citizen science for birds in Canada. I think here we had 300 participants in our Christmas bird count as
Holy
field
cow,
counters, field counters. That doesn't even include the feeder watchers for
that's
the
wild.
Victoria Circle. And we have 3 other circles on Southern Vancouver Island that a lot of the people actually do all 4 of them. As
Wow.
well as many other citizen science projects around. That was a great presentation. I'm sure that there's people that have questions. You can type them in the chat, or you can simply unmute and ask your question out loud. Or you might have some comments that you want to add. I do want to throw in something about the purple martins, because they're our poster child here in the West. In 1985, there were only 5 pairs left in BC, and now we're up well over 1,000 pairs. So that's why we're skewing your numbers. Um,
No
all,
doubt.
all the result of conservation efforts by people that were willing to go out there and put up nest boxes. Ours don't like the condos like you guys have
Okay.
in the east. They need townhouses. So a lot more bird boxes are necessary. But that's been just a brilliant recovery and a really good shining example of how we can turn things around.
Awesome. Yeah, it's ours are I mean, there's very few of them in Ontario breeding these days, and it's unfortunate, but it's great to hear that they're doing so well in BC.
Anybody with a question? Don't be
Yes,
shy. Anybody?
I do.
Okay. Go
there's,
ahead, Yannicka.
okay. That I really enjoyed your talk, Kyle. It was very inspiring and super interesting. The one area you didn't touch on was, for obvious reasons, because you have time constraints, is the data deficient species. Can you give us an idea of what some of those species families are and why they're data deficient? And is there anything that can be done to try and help monitor those particular species in a better way?
For sure. Yeah, the data deficient species typically fall into two categories. Either they spend their time in a remote location that's very hard to get to, or there's something about their behavior that makes them very hard to study. So, in the case of a remote location, a good handful of our Arctic birds are data deficient because there just simply are not a lot of people in the places that they spend their time. And in the instance of behavior, a bird like a seabird, especially a seabird which doesn't breed here in Canada, can be tricky. When we think about a seabird that breeds in Canada, I often think of something like on the East Coast, like Atlantic puffin. Atlantic puffin is not difficult to monitor because you go to the breeding colony and you say, well, there's a whole bunch of puffins and you can count them and it's not that hard. But if you think about a bird like an albatross, which nests on remote islands in the South Pacific and only visits Canadian waters in the winter, it's a very difficult bird to study. And it's even more difficult to study its behavior and its patterns in Canada. I mean, maybe you can visit the remote islands in the South Pacific, but so things like an albatross or a shearwater, which spends its non-breeding season in Canada, is very, very difficult to get good information on. So a lot of Arctic birds, a lot of seabirds, and then some birds from that aren't in those categories. A bird like king rail, for example. King rail lives in Canada only in small numbers in southern Ontario, and it's extremely secretive. So it's just very difficult to get good information on. So that's kind of a rough overview of the data deficient birds for sure. And in terms of, sorry, the second part of your question, in terms of things that people can do, it's very difficult for a lot of those groups because it's hard for a citizen scientist to participate in Arctic bird monitoring or, out to sea surveys. So there are limitations. I mean, citizen science is gonna continue to help fill gaps, certainly. For something like king rail, marsh monitoring surveys might help to elucidate what's going on with that bird, the more we do them. But in some cases, it's going to come down to a dedicated sort of, they're going to have to pay people to go monitor these birds, basically. And I think in some cases, like the Arctic birds, the incorporation of indigenous science is probably important as well, because those are the people who live there and they know things. So we should know what they know, you know. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough for some of those birds for sure.
Great.
Thank you, Kyle.
Kyle, there are some questions in the chat.
Okay.
One question about nature counts. If using eBird, are our checklists already being included in nature counts, or is there another step to ensure that data is being included?
For sure. So eBird and Nature Counts, they interact. So they interact in two ways. If you are doing a citizen science project where you're using the Nature Counts app, for example, the BC Coastal Waterbird Survey uses the Nature Counts app. You can check an option on Nature Counts to have your data pushed, synced to eBird. So if I go out and do a coastal waterbird survey and then I submit it to Nature Counts, if I have selected that, it automatically also gets submitted to my eBird account. So in that way, if you're submitting to Nature Counts, you don't have to also submit your checklist to eBird to make sure they're in there. But also, if you are looking for bird data, so if you're going to Nature Counts to get data on birds, Nature Counts has a partnership with eBird where those data are imported. So I can actually, through Nature Counts, get eBird data alongside coastal waterbird survey data and breeding bird survey data. So in that way, if you're getting data, Nature Counts is really a one-stop shop, and it includes eBird data as well. So
Excellent.
they interact very well.
Daniel, you have a question?
Yeah, Kyle, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. Can I ask you about Swifts?
Of course.
You mentioned with the willow ptarmigan that in some cases the error bars are quite large, so we have to be cautious with this sort of uptrend that we see, because these species are difficult to monitor, of course. But black swifts, you got the error bar is really tiny, and there's like a little bit of hope. They've declined a lot, but there seems to be a little bit of an increase towards the near end. Now, they are notoriously difficult to monitor. I mean, I recall talking to a Swift surveyor, and they had to climb into the site and wait till it was up almost absolutely dark before these swifts would return to the nest site, and they had like a couple of seconds to count the birds that were coming back down. So do we know that this is a true trend, or is it our effort has increased in counting these birds? Like there's more people looking, they're looking harder. That was a question.
Yes, it's a good question. And I almost hesitated to include black swift because it's a tricky, tricky bird,
Yeah.
but it's interesting because it's very relevant in BC, of course. The If you look at that black swift graph, maybe I'll throw it back up just because that's easy enough to do.
Yeah.
Here we are, back to black swift. Let's go backwards. There we go. If you look at the graph for black swift, the error bars in the beginning are quite large.
Yes.
And then as you get to the end, they're much smaller. And that, I think, reflects that increased effort to really study and understand the population of this bird. So, 50 years ago, the data are not as reliable, it's not as strong, we don't really know as well. But in recent years, because the effort has been so intensive to understand the population of black swift in Canada, the data become
Right.
more reliable and more confident. And it's black swift is not, the Canadian population is not very large. So that probably makes it a little bit easier to be certain as well. Although you stand to be proven wrong always. But I think it's hard to say. What makes this trend a little bit tricky to be really certain on is how big the error bars are in the beginning. So was the population that high? How confident are we in that? Well, I think we're much more confident about the population now. So yeah, it's a little bit tricky maybe. And that's a nuance that we've tried really to reflect in the text in the species accounts. So when you go to the species accounts, it explains where the trend is coming from and sort of how relatively certain we are in that trend. It actually ranks the certainty and the confidence level in these. So, but yeah, Black Swift is very tricky, and I won't by any means suggest that I'm a Black Swift expert. We do have a team at Birds
No.
Canada who works on Black Swift, and they know all kinds of great things. But it is a mysterious bird, and there's still things to learn about its migration path and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, it's a very good
Yeah.
question. I think it's very likely it has declined since 1970. Whether that decline is exactly 87%, I don't know that we
Yeah.
can be super confident, but I think it's very likely that it has declined.
Now, Kyle, we have another Swift here in BC, the Boxer Swift, and it's also declining. And of course, this is just an observation and an appeal to how important the conservation is that you pointed out, or the action, right? Because of course they're now nesting not behind waterfalls, but in the old growth, which is disappearing rapidly. And one experience that I just wanted to share, because I think it's very powerful, is when Leo and I did a hike on the Sunshine Coast, and we just found ourselves just by chance in the on the Sunshine Coast Trail. There was a cut block of yellow cedar, original old growth forest of yellow cedar. And it was only like 800 by 800 meters. All around it was logged and second grow, but in that cut block, the Vox's swifts were nesting and they were all over the map. They found that little block. And so I think, like you could say, oh, there's so little left, it doesn't matter. I think it does matter. And so if you set it aside, they will come and they will find it and they'll hang in there. Right. But
Yeah.
if it's all gone, then it's all gone.
Yeah, that's a fantastic observation. And certainly for a colonial nesting bird like that, I mean, a small patch can be crucial. Right? It can support a large number of individuals. So yeah, that's
Thank you so much, Kyle.
a really fascinating observation. Yeah, thank you for that.
The one thing I wanted to ask about the swifts, since they've now found that some of the swifts don't really go into other land in their wintering, that they stay aloft all year. Do you think there's the possibility that the black swifts may be doing the same? That the reason you can't find where they're roosting in the winter is because they're not.
Yeah, I could certainly see with Black Swift. I mean, why couldn't it, if it's making a journey to South America, why does it need to stop almost? I mean, this is a fast flyer, a powerful flyer. It's feeding on insects in the air. So I think that, yeah, maybe it doesn't roost or it's very cryptic about its roosting. I could see that being very likely. So
So another
Yeah.
question from the chat. Do you have any information about flammulated owls in the Okanagan, or are they one of your species that insufficient data?
That's a good question, actually. To be quite honest, I don't know what we know or don't know about flammulated owls. There's so many birds, in these species
Yes.
accounts. I certainly don't know them all really well, but yeah, I will look. I'm curious now as well. I will look that up afterwards, and you certainly can pop onto the species account there and see everything that we do know about flammulated owls. But I don't know a lot about them myself.
Any questions in the room here? No? Okay, there's certainly some comments thanking you for this presentation. Allison says, really appreciate you talking about what we can do too. No regrets conservation.
For sure, yeah, no, it's that's a big part. We're trying to get people motivated to act, so hopefully it does that.
Lots and lots of thank yous. Also other people's experiences. We have grasslands in BC, but in smaller pockets than the prairies, the Thompson River Valley, the Okanagan, the Chilcotin, Peace River Valley, and even the Garry Oak Meadow habitat on Vancouver Island. And the Grassland Council of BC are trying hard to make the public more aware of the precious nature of our grasslands. Peregrine's falcons nesting on BC hydro towers in the lower mainland, and possibly even on a building in downtown Victoria.
Neat.
And I don't see any other questions. This is your last chance to post a question or ask.
And
Yes.
could you ask the question if the breeding bird survey program needs any more volunteers to help out?
I could probably even answer that question. Kyle, does the breeding bird survey need more people to help with the surveys on Southern Vancouver Island?
That's you might be able to answer it better than me, Anne, but the breeding bird survey is primarily administered by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and they have a website you can see, I believe have a website where you can see available routes.
Yes.
Do you feel free to fill in here, Anne, if I don't know a lot about
as far as I know,
bird survey.
As far as I know, we are very short on people covering routes
Oh, there you
for
go.
breeding bird survey on the island. So if you're interested, if you go to their site, you should be able to see what routes are available.
Thank you.
But thanks for the reminder, Jim,
You're
to get everybody else thinking about maybe they can do that too.
For sure. Yeah, no, breeding bird survey, it's fun to do, so it's definitely worth taking it up if you have the time. I was just gonna see if I could find the route adoption, but maybe I can't.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kyle. I neglected to mention that our Christmas bird count, the Victoria count, we had 300 field participants, but we also got 135 species. The numbers of species was about average or the number of individuals is about average for us, and all of the results will be linked and posted in the next issue of The Naturalist, which will come out in February, I think. Or yeah, I think it comes out in February. yeah, so thanks everybody for coming. Daniel, did you want to say anything about the Sydney count?
Yes, so the Sydney count will be in that in that issue for the Victorian Naturalist. I think it comes out. Usually we see it the very last day of February in our mailbox, certainly by early March. And we had a good count, a high species count, good weather. Again, sorry, Anne.
Thanks.
Yes, but so you will be able to read up on that.
Great. Okay, and I don't see any of the other Christmas bird count coordinators in the room, but yell out if you are. I don't think there are any of the others, but yeah, Victoria's count had the worst weather of all four. But we still had 300 people out, guys. So that's
So
really good. Yeah, so thanks to everybody, and especially to Kyle for coming and doing this presentation. And let me just make sure there's no last minute questions. No, lots of kudos though, lots of excellent presentation. Thanks for sharing your information. Really enjoyed all of that. So thank you again, Kyle, for staying up late with us. And we really do appreciate you coming.
yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all your great questions.
Thank you very much. Good night, everybody, and we'll see you next month.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Kyle.